Well, today I'm talking to my great friend Sue Atkins. Sue and I have known one another for about 35 years, and we worked closely together for probably about 15 years. Now, personally, I've learned an enormous amount from Sue over the years, but more importantly, she's been an immensely influential figure in the lexicographic community, both in the UK and really worldwide. Sue's impact on the profession, on the way we produce dictionaries, on the way we think about language, really can't be overestimated. So Sue, we're talking about, we're reviewing your career, your achievements today, and I guess we may as well start at the beginning, and I'd like to kick off by asking you how you got into lexicography, when you got into lexicography, and what was it like in those days?
Well, you talk about it as a career, but did you ever think you had a career in lexicography? You're one of the most distinguished lexicographers I know, and nobody ever thinks they have a career in lexicography.
No, I think you have to be suspicious of people who
Absolutely.
say that that's what they want.
Exactly. I fell into lexicography through sheer poverty. I married a clergyman. I'm still married to the same guy, but he's not a clergyman at the moment. But we had therefore no money, and we had a small baby, and we had even less money then. So I had to think of some way of enlarging our income, and I decided I would set up a work agency for people like me who had degrees and no money and were married and had children. So I founded an agency called Graduate, and I managed to find quite a lot of quirky little jobs for a lot of people who were on the register. And when we left Edinburgh a year later, I sold Graduate to an unemployed graduate, obviously. And the last thing I did before we left Edinburgh was put my name on the Graduate list. And about 3 years later, when we had at least one, if not two more children, and we were even more poverty-stricken, I had a letter from Collins, and it said something like, "Dear Mrs. Atkins, we are looking for people to write a French dictionary. If you can help, please telephone this number." So I phoned Collins, and they said, "Do come in for an interview." So I went up from Galashiels, where we lived at the time, and I was interviewed by a Collins representative who said, "You are the 10th person that I've seen today, and therefore I'm going to give you the 10th letter of the alphabet. Here is the letter H," she said, giving me a sheaf of words. "Please go home and write the dictionary entries for it."
Just
So
like
I
that.
said, "What kind of a dictionary?" And she said, "Oh, a French dictionary, of course." So I said, "How big?" She said, "Well, you must just see what space you need to write the entries." So I said, "Well, can you tell me how I should do it?" She said, "Look at other dictionaries." And I said, "Well, I've only got one other dictionary." She said, "Oh, we can't afford to buy you reference books. You probably got enough in the house." So she said, "Bring H back, fully compiled, and we'll give you £100. So I went off, and over the months and years, months perhaps, I completed the letter H. And gradually, as things went on, I realised how terrible I was at writing dictionaries, so I had to start at the beginning. And I had no word from Collins. I occasionally rang them up and said, for instance, what shall I do with a word like hammer, where there's a verb and a noun? And they would say, "Just do what you think best, dear." and I would say, "Well, do I do the verb first or the noun?" "Oh, no, just do what you think best. That will be a good dictionary if it works for you." So after all this time, I went back with the letter H compiled. So I have to say, really, during the whole of this time, I was motivated by avoiding the pitfalls that somebody writing Harrop's French dictionary had produced for students like me, because Harrop's was the most irritating dictionary. The word sense you were looking for was definitely in there somewhere, but you couldn't find it. And many years later, when I started to teach lexicography myself, I realised why this was the case. Because, of course, Harrop's was written by René Ledessert for a French audience, so his entries were perfect for francophones and almost impossible to use for anglophones, and this was the only good dictionary that we had available. So, dodging all the pitfalls of Harrop's, I realised I needed a French person, and as it happened, we had one to hand Michel Potet, who himself went on to be a very distinguished linguist in French academia. He was my lodger, and he was an assistant at the local lycée. And we finished up with him writing the French of each entry and me writing English after supper when the children were in bed, and I had to stop charging him board and lodgings for this. And between us we wrote the letter H. And I enjoyed it, Michel, if ever you see this. I really enjoyed it. So I got in a bus, and most of letter H had been written on index cards, 6x6 index cards. But as we got to words like have, it got extremely difficult to keep tabs on have if you were writing on 6x6 index cards. And also, Collins were worried about the index cards for a completely different reason, because we had to post back our work every week. And of course, index cards were heavy to post. So I gradually managed to get them to allow us to write on A4 paper. So anyway, I packed up a suitcase full of index cards and A4 paper and went back to Collins. Saw the same person, gave her my letter H. And she said, "That's very nice, you've done so well." She said, "Would you like another letter?" And I said, "Why, where are you in the alphabet?" And she said, "Well, actually, we've only got the letter H." And I said, "What happened to..." Now, I wrote it down somewhere so that I would remember what she said. And I found my notes, so I'll tell you what she said. I said, "What happened to A, B, C, D, and E and all the 9 interviewees before me?" So she said, "Well, the woman that got A had a nervous breakdown and set her study on fire, and we haven't heard from her since we read about it in the paper. The woman that got B attacked her husband, and she's now resting in Ward 9 of somewhere. C had erupted into Collins's office, hurled a box of blank index cards at them and vanished in a cloud of oaths. D had sent them a tear-stained letter resigning, quote, in order to save her marriage."
That sounds familiar, yeah.
Yes, that sounds very familiar to many lexicographers. And E had returned to the prison service because she found it less stressful in the long run. So those of you out there thinking of making lexicography a career, let that be.
So you were the only one left then?
I was the sole survivor.
And I'm interested to know what you talk about index cards. I mean, what were the mechanics of it in those days, and what technology was available to you?
Well, we had 3 different colours of pen. Black. We had black pens to write with, and we had a red pen and a green pen and a black pen to underline bits of it. And we were told not to bother dotting our I's because it would take too long. Just write as fast as you can, we can understand. And we finished up with a text which had head words written in black, underlined in bold, underlined in red, which meant bold.
Meant they were bold, right?
And the examples were all underlined in black.
Which meant they were italics, I suppose?
Which meant they were italics,
Yeah,
except they may have been green. This is a very long time ago.
Yeah.
And then the green was some other kind of typeface. And that way we all finished up with a typeface which many years later IBM were to, and Thierry Fontenelle did this as well, decode the whole structure of the dictionary, the infrastructure as it were of all the entries from the typeface, whether it was in French or English or from the typeface. So it turned out to be quite useful.
So it was pretty low tech.
It was very low tech, and I had to post a packet of text back to Collins every week. And everyone did that from all over France and England, and we never lost a single package.
But it seems that there was no sort of supervision or feedback or guidance.
Well, there was a certain amount of feedback because I would send it in and they would type it up. And we had some quite good secretaries who'd done higher, this is in Glasgow, Collins, they had done higher French, so they commented down the side. So Collins used to ring me up and read me their comments. And I had to explain to Collins that my French informants and I had spent a long time on these entries, and that we thought we probably knew more than the typists. So after a while they stopped doing that. But for a while I thought how useful it would have been to write a Chinese dictionary, but yes.
And who were you working with on the Collins project?
Well, in Collins, when I wrote H I was entirely alone. But when I discovered I was the sole survivor, I think I was almost immediately promoted to be an editor of some sort. Mm-hmm. I don't think I did that for myself. I think that actually did come from Collins. Because they said, well, we're going to have to get more people to help you if you're going to take as long as this to do H.
They were complaining as well.
Yeah, 6 months, I mean, for the letter H alone with Harrop and some English dictionaries. Of course, what I also had was, by that time I had a card index full of quotes that I'd heard here and there for words that were coming up.
So you were collecting a bit of a corpus even then. And,
yes, and of course every time I read a newspaper, the content was irrelevant, it was just simply the form that was important.
Yeah, and we still do that.
Still do that. I can't read anything, especially men news. I can't read men news anyway. So then, I have to say that I discovered, I think at the end of H, that Collins had already had someone compile the whole of the French-English half. So they said, don't worry about the French-English half, just do the English-French half. So I said, well, would it be possible to see the French-English half? Because people using the dictionary would have the same thing bound together in the same book. And they said, what an original idea. Well, yes, of course you must. So they then brought in an orange box full of index cards. They said, help yourself. So I picked out by chance. This dictionary, I must say, had been written by the wife of a member of the French Institute in Glasgow, a French wife of a member. And she'd been asked to write the French-English half, and she'd done it. I picked out a single card on which the word sage, which is probably 2 or 3 inches in an ordinary dictionary, had been compiled, and sage consisted of 19 English words, separated by semicolons with no indicators at all. No register markers, no sense markers. And it began at wise, well-behaved, good, sensible. It was unbelievable. So it didn't take long.
Although that was not unusual. I mean, the Old Chambers monolingual dictionary did pretty much the same.
Pretty well like that, yes. Well, eventually I managed to persuade Collins to hold a bonfire of the vanities in the first half of the dictionary, and they then put together a really good team. And it was led by Alain Duval. Alain died 2 or 3 years ago, but he was a great friend and an absolutely wonderful linguist. An absolutely complete, perfect control and command of English. And a very sensitive linguistic person. And he was really very, very good to work with. And I worked with Alain on all the various incarnations of Collins' dictionary that turned out. And I also worked with Hélène Lewis on that dictionary, and she was my main French informant. And she was really extremely good as well, Hélène from Bournemouth. And then I had actually 3 informants going. I wrote the English, and once I had an outline entry into which I had scribbled in pencil French words here and there, and notes about what the English meant and what the French didn't mean, and so on. Then I would send it to one of my 3 informants. One was Hélène Lewis, one was Marie-Noël Lamy, who went on to be a professor at the Open University, and one was René Burks, who was a lecturer at Glasgow University. And between them, they would write the French in, send it back to me. I would read what they'd said. I would realise that the English didn't mean what the French said here, and so on. And then we had quite long discussions on each half inch of text. And then I would finalise the text. And mostly we had long phone calls. You probably don't remember this, Michael, but the telephone got much cheaper at 6:30. So we did all our phone calls in the evening. And Marie-Noël Lamy once rang me up, and she was in complete hysterics. It just came after subscriber trunk dialing, and she dialed my Sussex number and then my telephone number. And a man had answered the phone, and she said, "Hello, Peter, can I speak to Sue?" And he said, yes, hold on a bit. And another woman's voice came and said, "Hello." Marie-Noël said, "Oh, Sue, I'm going mad here. I have got if all over the kitchen floor. I've moved lots of bits of it here, there, and everywhere. I can't make sense of it, and I'm really going mad." And the woman said, "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but my husband is a doctor, and if you don't put the phone down at once, I will call the police." And it turned out that she'd actually dialed a number in Southampton and got a Peter and a Sue.
Oh, what are the odds?
But it's true. It's true what she said about if was really terrible. It was all over my kitchen floor as well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yes. So then they started the French side. The French team started again, but by that time I had written about 100 pages of what we called compiler's instructions, telling people how we wrote our English entries so that their French entries could echo the same structure.
So this was really the first style guide.
First style guide that Collins had ever.
With, yeah.
They said, what a good idea when I suggested it, so I think it was the first one they'd thought of it. And everything worked quite well that way, except that the most difficult of all, to keep parallel. Rosie Milne, who'd been an English editor in the original stages of the dictionary with me, and she was very good, very bright, Rosie, and very, very good. Rosie moved over to be the English editor on the French side. And we could keep everything more or less right, except we had terrible trouble with register labels.
Why?
Because, well, you know what register, familiar, informal, taboo, formal. It's very difficult. Even if you're writing a whole dictionary yourself, it's very difficult to remember when you get to V and W what you are marking in formal and B. Yeah. So Rosie and I had this, we decided first of all that we wouldn't use the words familiar or informal. We would put one asterisk on a word. Now the way we described it to lexicographers, you'd put one asterisk on a word that you would use around the family table if your parents were reasonably liberal. We had two asterisks on a word that you would never use to your grandmother, and three asterisks on a word that the police would arrest you if you called them that word. Right. So that was our register, 1, 2, 3 asterisks. Yeah.
It's about as robust as actually any guide to register. It's
as long as people had the same kind of
It's
grandmother.
a very under-researched area, I think.
That's right. So every time anyone asks me for a PhD thesis, I always say register.
And
anyway,
no one's ever taken us up on it.
Rosie and I decided that the only way to keep them even was every time we put an asterisk or anything on any word, we wrote it on a postcard, and when the postcard was and the postcard was full, we just sent it to each other. Yeah. And this worked very well for about 3 or 4 years, I think. And then one day the doorbell rang, and there was a very irate postman standing outside, and he said, "My colleagues have asked me to speak to you about this." And I said, "Why?" And he waved a postcard at me, and on the postcard it said, "Blow!" ! 1 asterisk. "Oh shit!" 3 asterisks, etc. And he said, "We don't like this in the sorting office." And I said, "Well, I thought you weren't supposed to read the stuff in the sorting office." And he said, "Some things just leap out at you, even early in the morning." So after that, Rosie and I put them in envelopes.
Yeah,
and that's how
we wrote our solution. Yeah,
we wrote our labelling. Yeah.
So, when did the Robert finish? When did you move on from there?
It became the Collins Robert, and it was published in 1978.
Right. And it was at that time that you were then developing the ideas for the Cobuild.
No, we didn't. Well, Cobuild started in a different way, because my brother and I went on holiday. We should make clear
who your brother is.
Oh, my brother, yes, my brother. John Sinclair, distinguished linguist, now sadly not with us, but very distinguished linguist, and a typical brother in every possible way. And I'm sure he would have said I was a typical sibling, sister in every possible way. But we were on holiday with our spouses and 3 children each in a French field, and we were talking about lexicography. And I said, well, the real trouble about lexicography is that by the time the dictionary's in print, you've thrown away 90% of what you knew about the words. And if you don't throw that 90% away, no one would ever use the dictionary. And he said, well, I have a means of keeping the 90% and using it. And he explained about a corpus, and he wanted to build a corpus. He wanted to do a dictionary from a corpus, and he had a computer officer in mind. And as a result, he talked to Collins, and Collins set up the Cobuild operation, where you and I met.
Indeed, we did, yes. In about 83 or something like that.
Yes, something like that.
But how did you appoint people when you were working on the Collins Robert?
Well, I didn't appoint anyone. Collins did this, and they had a good script that they stuck to pretty thoroughly, and it went. You've written in for a job as a lexicographer. Can you read? Yes. Can you write? Yes. Are you an unemployed language graduate? Yes. Would you work non-stop for hours and hours for very little pay and starve in a garret? Yes, please. And they got the job, and that was the way they appointed. And I'm sure this is the case for many publishers.
Yeah, it probably was in those days. Yes.
I must tell you about one other person in the Collins Robert team. Because in the days when they were gathering together my team of drafters, they appointed a lady who had been the chief inspectress of schools for modern languages, and she had retired about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was training her. we were at a meeting with Jan Collins, who was the head honcho at that
the
time.
family, yeah.
And before I could stop her, she said, "Oh, Mr. Collins," she said, "it's such an honour to be associated with this project. I will not ask for money." Well, you can imagine. I mean, I was forced to interrupt at once and said, "If you don't want to pay her, just continue to pay the rest of us." Yeah. Anyway, let's say she was called Miss Hardman Smythe. That's a good word. And my compiler's instructions were quite good and detailed, but what they didn't tell people was how to choose examples, because I didn't know myself.
Mm-hmm.
That was, if I left something out, it was because I didn't know how to do it. So
yeah.
Miss Hardman Smythe went away, and I gave her a lot of easy words out of the letter B, and she came back with the word bib. Now, bib on an ordinary French dictionary might be 2 lines. It would be bavette, and it would be bib and tucker phrase. Her entry would have been this size. So I said,
"Oh, I've known people like that."
Hear it. So I said, "Read me out the examples." And she said, "Oh, what a lovely bib your baby has. Oh, is that a new bib? Oh, there is a piece of milk or some milk on his bib." And it went through that. So I explained that in order to justify its space in a dictionary, an example must be saying something other than just the fact that bib was bavette. So we more or less got through that. And then at that point in our acquaintanceship, Collins Robert brought out the Petit Robert.
Oh, yeah.
And the Petit Robert was full of really good examples, a lot of them literary, but they were very good. So I said to her, "Well, look, why don't you look at the Petit Robert and see how they use examples and take them from there?" So a couple of weeks later, she arrived again for another tutorial. And I'd given her a longer word this time. And she'd done the word big. Now, she thought big is grand, and she looked up grand in the Petit Robert. And one of her examples was magnificent. It was. The English was, "However big kings are, they are what we are. And they can make mistakes just like we can." And this was translated into French Alexandrins. "Pour grand que soient les rois, ils sont ce que nous sommes. Ils peuvent se tromper comme les autres hommes."
Yeah.
So I thought, well, we just cannot produce a dictionary where the translations are in Alexandrins. So I then explained that she must try to reduce the examples and make them as tight as possible, as short as possible, as tight as possible. By that time I had reached the letter D.
And how did that go?
I gave her the word dam, D-A-M. Now the word dam in English is simple. It's the thing that holds the water back, and it's the water. In French, the thing that holds the water back is barrage, and the water itself is réservoir. And her dam had only one single example, and it was perfect. It said, "He jumped off the dam and drowned himself in the dam. Il a sauté du barrage, il s'est noyé dans le réservoir."
Perfect.
Yes,
Yeah.
lovely.
So I guess she didn't really last the course.
No, that was the last I saw of her. She said she was going to take up tapestry again.
Yeah, probably a good
Yes.
a good decision, I would think. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I met you, Sue, was they had a system in Cobuild where the new editors would produce some lexicographic text, and this would be sent down to you for reviewing it, and then they would troop down individually to your house in Sussex.
And stay for days.
Stay for a couple of days. And I do remember several of these people coming back to Birmingham, ashen-faced, and when it was my turn to do that, I was, all sorts of dire warnings were given that, this is going to be dreadful, and I hope you'll be all right. And we got on like a house on fire, as I remember.
We did, I think, yes, absolutely.
It turned out pretty well.
Turns out you were writing better entries than me. I think you only lasted a day, and then I sent you home again. That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, it was fun. So, but I mean, any observations on the Cobuild project more generally?
Yeah, well, the Cobuild project was, I'm afraid it was the sort of brother and sister project that simply didn't work out from a sibling point of view, although it did produce a dictionary in the end. And looking back on it, I think it wasn't necessarily the brother-sister relationship, but it was because my brother John saw Cobuild essentially as a publisher-funded research project.
Yeah.
And although we set up schedules and we set up timetables, we set up publishing dates, we set up 10% of text by this time, this didn't mean anything to him, because what he wanted to do, which is what he did excellently for the whole of his career, was inspire his students to think.
Yeah.
And the way he inspired his students to think was not to tell them what to think, Whereas the way we write a dictionary is to tell people not only what to think, but what to do and how to do it and when to do it.
Those two things are
and John's,
not very compatible, aren't they?
I had hoped by the time I went to Cobuild, I had already written the whole of the English-French side of the Collins-Robert, and I was aware of terrible problems in English that I simply couldn't solve. I mean, I simply didn't know where to start. One of them was phrasal verbs.
Right.
And in fact, Tom MacArthur had given us a sort of ad hoc way of dealing with phrasal verbs, but theoretically it wasn't very good to extend. It certainly wasn't very good to extend into non-bilingual dictionaries. And I thought that John, as a grammarian, would have a fully equipped grammar in his head, and he could then tell us how to deal with all these things. But of course, John's grammar was extremely inchoate. It was at the embryonic stage, and it was coming from the work he was doing with his students.
Yeah.
So this was very difficult, and eventually I left Cobuild, and it was taken over by Patrick Hanks, whom everybody knows as a great lexicographer and a very, very gifted linguist, Patrick, especially in lexical semantics. And
also, often not mentioned, a great project manager.
Yes, a very good
terrific
project manager.
Track record in that area.
Of getting dictionaries
and of course,
up.
the Cobuild project, as you say, there was this inherent incompatibility between the academic
Between the
goals
funders and
the commercial
the
publishing.
fundees.
And yet, of course, it was a hugely significant project.
Yes.
Um,
So, well, Patrick had just, in fact, finished bailing out, I think, the English dictionary.
Yeah.
The full English
Collins
dictionary.
English Dictionary.
Yes. So I was. That's when I met Patrick first too. And Patrick did a great job with Cobuild, except for the grammar, because of course he couldn't make any mark on the grammar. And as a result, just before it went to press, Richard Thomas and I, through the whole, we appointed two lexicographers with strong grammarian tendencies, John Ato and
would it have been Janet?
John Ato and Janet Whitkett.
Whitkett, yeah.
Whitkett. And we asked them simply to rationalise the grammar. And we had, for instance, I'll give you an example of what a very good research project might turn out, but no good for dictionaries. The word Mr., the word Mrs. and the word Miss all belong to different word classes because of the context they'd been found in. Now, the context-based grammar came from a 3 million word corpus.
Yeah, not very big by today's
And
standards.
it was impossible to build a theory on that amount of data. On top of that, Miss contained as an example, and also John was wedded to the corpus. Everything had to come from the corpus. All the examples had to be real corpus examples. And I felt that I still feel a dictionary is a dialogue between the lexicographer and the user. And if the user, with the best will in the world and reasonably talented, cannot make sense of the dictionary entry, then that's the lexicographer's fault.
Yeah,
You would
it's not
agree,
the
wouldn't
user.
you?
I absolutely would. I mean, I think that the principle of sourcing examples directly from the corpus is a very sound one, but when your corpus is only 5 or 6 million words long, or you're simply not going to get enough.
But
Once
even
you get
then,
outside the top,
you have to.
the most frequent words, you won't get enough.
I agree, but I think it's more than that, because I believe if you're putting in a dictionary entry in an example, the example must be exemplifying something that you want, a fact you want to get across to somebody, and they've got to understand the example.
Yeah.
Well, in the word miss, the example, in the sense of the now discredited sense of Miss Universe, etc., the only example in
Donald
the
Trump
corpus,
sense,
yes, Donald Trump land. Oh. The only example in the corpus was Miss Isle of Dogs 1973. And I wanted to remove this from the dictionary, and John didn't want to remove it, and Collins removed it without asking him before it went to print.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's their privilege, I
That's
suppose.
Collins,
Yes.
absolutely. Yeah.
So, as I recall, during the Cobuild project, it was that Euralex, the
Absolutely.
International Association for Lexicographers, was set up and had its first conference in Exeter, 1983, wasn't it?
Yes. You went,
I
but
was
we didn't
there,
meet
yes,
across a crowded room.
We must have somehow met there, yeah.
No,
I mean,
Collins let Hélène Lewis, Alain Duval and me go
mhm.
on condition that we worked at least 5 hours a day on the dictionary text we were preparing. And as a result, what we finished up doing was doing it in the evenings in the corner of a common room. And we finished that with a bigger audience than many of the talks.
Yeah.
Because it was like living in
yeah.
a zoo. We were the real
Yeah.
lexicographers doing real dictionaries.
Right, yeah.
And we all wrote, that was the first condition. The second condition was we were not allowed to speak to any lexicographer from any publishing house other than Collins, which there were only the three of us to talk to.
Yeah.
And we didn't particularly want to talk to the academics because they were too busy telling us how to write dictionaries, so we didn't feel there was much future in that conversation. So
But in fact, you went on to become president of Euralex.
Yes, I got elected to the board of Euralex at that point.
So, yeah.
And I was secretary for a long time.
Oh, all right. They
And
cast
then
you in the role of secretary to begin with.
Absolutely.
You were probably the only woman
I
on
soon
the
realised
board.
why I'd been made secretary, yes.
Yes.
And then I became president eventually,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So, and this sort of segues into your ventures into, or your collaboration with people in academia, because
Yes.
it sounds as if by this time you'd amassed a number of questions about how language works
Yes.
and how grammar works and so on, that you were sort of very keen to find answers for, and began to look for
Yes, I agree.
people in the academic world who you thought might be able to
I still thought out there somewhere there is a linguist who can answer these awful problems. I mean, like what do you do with noun plus noun compounds? What do you do with adjectives? What do you do with word order? What can you do with anything these things? And so through Euralex I began to meet very distinguished people who turned out to be, many of them lexical semanticists, and with just the sort of
the best kind,
useful information. Unless you count the University of Birmingham and Cobuild, it was my first plunge into academia. And I did find there were a lot of academics that were trying to tell us how to write dictionaries. But there were also some really, really interesting people who themselves had wrestled with the same kind of problems, and who also had found solutions which I could adapt for lexicography. And that was quite a high criterion, because A, I had to understand them, which I didn't always, and B, I had to be able to formulate them in terms of lexicographic instructions to a team. Amongst the people, for instance, that I met through Euralex was Yuri Apresian, who was an absolute bundle of energy and original thinking and a delight. I led a workshop with him in 2002 or something like that, a pre-Euralex workshop. He was a great lexical semanticist. I also met a lot of people who used dictionaries, and some of them were very interesting in the comments that they made on dictionary structure. For instance, Krista Varantola, who went on to have a very distinguished career in academia as a vice-chancellor and things. But she was a very honest translator, and she and I had a lot of things in common when we started to discuss the problems of dictionaries. And then, of course, on the board of Euralex with me was that great man Tony Cowie, and we lost Tony, 5, 6, 10 years ago now?
No, it wouldn't have been 10. No, maybe 5.
He was associated in everybody's mind with Hornby's dictionary.
Of course, yeah.
And he was a brilliant lexicographer and a brilliant linguist as well, and very...
A very nice man.
And he's very rooted, his feet were on the ground, he knew what he was talking about with dictionaries, yes. And and he and I set up a big project which Della Summers, Janet Whitcutt and other people took part in, on finding out how people actually use dictionaries across Europe, and we published the results of that, and that was very interesting. It proved my point that everybody under the age of 16 is genetically programmed not to read italics, for instance, so there's no good putting anything in italics in a dictionary if you want your school students to read it. And also,
and that's worth knowing, isn't it?
Yes, in a bilingual dictionary, most people, the first foreign word they come to is in their text at once. They don't read beyond the first word they don't understand.
Yeah,
So
those are all kind of very familiar notions now, but of course you have to find them out the first time.
Well, my aim in writing the French dictionary was to stop people from using it and then making other people laugh when they tried to say things in French. I felt that was a pretty low bar, to start from.
Yeah, I seem to remember via Euralex, wasn't that how we produced, myself and many other people produced a festschrift for you?
Yes.
When was that?
I think I got the Festschrift
15
in
years
when
ago or
a couple of years after I stopped being president.
Mm.
That was undoubtedly the most moving and the honour, and I've had several, but it was the honour that I appreciate most. I think a Festschrift from your fellow lexicographer says something, and it was wonderful. I was so pleased to have it, yes.
Yeah, that's great. So, going back to your career in publishing, so you spent time at in the Cobuild project. So what do you do after that?
Well, after that, I was kind of at a loose end. Collins didn't know what to do with me. They put me on the staff sort of inadvertently to keep me there. So since I was at a loose end, and since I had then started to get interested in how you could use computers to make life tolerable for lexicographers, and also how, of course, you could use corpora. And through my contacts particularly with Antonio Zampoli, who was the lifeblood of European linguistic research in those days, computational research. I had met through Zampoli, he formed a thing called the Pisa group.
Yeah.
And the Pisa group was a group of about 10 or 12, I think they were all Americans, but Zampoli and me and Nicoletta Calzolari, another extremely gifted linguist, colleague of Zampoli's.
And was Igor Mel'čuk part of that group?
No, Mel'čuk wasn't. Okay. But it started at the Grosseto conference. Oh, yeah. I did meet Mel'čuk. It started at the Grosseto conference. The Pisa group came after the Grosseto conference. Antonio Zampoli got a some funding from the EU, from the 13th Directorate, to hold a conference, the aim of which was to see how much linguistic information could be automatically extracted from published dictionaries.
Yeah.
And Della Summers from Longman was there, and I was there, and a lot of other people, not too many Americans, because that was just when there was the Libya bombing and a lot of Americans had withdrawn. And Chuck, in fact, Chuck Fillmore had been meaning to go, but didn't go. And in Grosseto, I met a lot of people that I worked with later, Beth Levin and Judy Cagle, for instance, Annie Zenin. And these people were formed by Zampoli into a Pisa, what they called the Pisa group.
So he was very influential then, bringing these people together.
Without any doubt. He was a catalyst for a lot of the work that was done internationally.
And you did some work with Beth Levin and Judy Cagle. There's a paper, I remember, on the word bake.
The reason it was bake was because the Pisa group of American academics and me and Zampoli and Nicoletta started with the idea that they would write a few dictionary entries to show us how to do it. So they started with the word bake. And when we had our first meeting, it was clear that no one had got very far with the word bake. So I was able to explain to them why they hadn't got far with the word bake, because I was a great source of problems, and the bake is a great source of problems. And Beth Levin particularly was working on her work on lexical semantics, and it seemed to me that she had a lot of the answers to the problems that I had. So she and I got talking, and Judy Cagle was there too, and Judy and I and Beth got talking, and we started right up the letter, the word bake, and it was very interesting. But eventually I didn't do a lot of work with Beth, partly because I didn't understand half of what she told me about language. And I felt that I wasn't going to live long enough to go back to the beginning and start again. And also I was trying to write dictionaries at the same time. But also because Beth's linguistics are so delicate and so finely tuned that even if I had understood it all, I couldn't possibly have applied it in a published dictionary. But it was very interesting. Beth was the most meticulous researcher I've ever met. She was brilliant. But it was at Grosseto conference that I met Mel'čuk. Did I ever tell you about how I met Mel'čuk?
I think you might have done, but...
Shall I tell you again?
I think you should tell me again and tell everybody else. Yeah.
So I was walking along to the afternoon session, and it was in Grosseto, in front of a flight of steps leading up to a big church. And who should come up across the steps but Mel'čuk, to whom I had never spoken, because I was, of course, in awe of him even then, because I knew the work he was doing. And he said to me, "You are at the Grosseto conference." Mel'čuk is very given to making authoritative statements.
Declarative statements.
So I said, "Yes." And he said, you're writing dictionaries, you work for a publisher. Now that's a bit accusatory, but anyway, I said yes. And he said, well, tell me what you do with noun plus noun compounds. Now, by a blessed miracle, I had just written a note about noun plus noun compounds for Cobuild to say what we do about noun plus noun compounds. Yeah. I divided them into 3, and they were easily identifiable by a gang of lexicographers. So I explained this to Mel'čuk, and he stood for a long time like this. Then he said, "You are right." So I thought, well, yeah. So I said, "How do you know I'm right?" So he said, "You agree with me."
Oh yeah, that sounds like Mel'čuk.
So then I thought, well. So I said, "How do you know you're right?" So he said, "God told me." Well, there's no answer to that. But later, when I was working with Euralex, who's a great friend and colleague,
colleagues, weren't they,
yes,
back in the
Mel'čuk,
day?
I told Yuri about this, and Yuri stood for a long moment. Then he said, "God was right," and I thought that was rather nice. Yes, Mel'čuk is a brilliant academic lexicographer,
yes, and just so full of boundless energy.
Yes, me too.
And ideas.
Such energy.
He's a very remarkable person. You kind of knew when he was in the room. Anyway.
Yes, you certainly did. You knew when he was in the continent, actually.
But going from someone like that to a much more self-effacing but equally brilliant linguist, I wanted to ask you about your meeting with Charles Fillmore and the work that you did with him.
Oh yes, well, that was partly at Cobuild as well. Because the Pisa group that I explained about was asked to give a lexical workshop lasting 3 or 4 days before the Institute of Linguists, the American Institute of Linguists summer school, which was in Stanford University. So Annie Zenon and Judy Cagle and Beth Levin and I were taken by Annie up to Calistoga, where they had mud baths, and we lay in mud baths and talked about verbs and things, and came back with some ideas. And Chuck Fillmore was there, and many other equally distinct, or nearly distinguished linguists. And after a day or two, Chuck came up to me and introduced himself. And he said, "I wonder if you would have breakfast with me one morning, because I have a problem." So fair enough, so I had breakfast with him. You know what American breakfasts are like, like a feast for Henry VIII, So. And Chuck said, "My real problem is that I've been given this dictionary to review, and I want to say things about it, but and this is so typical of Chuck. He said, it may be that I do not understand what should be going on here, and I wondered if you could tell me whether these are valid criticisms." And in fact, he was reviewing Cobuild. And
I remember that review, because it was a review of Cobuild and Eldo's second edition,
yes.
which I was the editor of.
Yes, that's
and
right.
It was the review was called Two Dictionaries, wasn't it?
You came out better than Cobuild, I seem to remember. But
it depends on what.
He was talking about the entry for carrion.
Yes.
And his problem was that the entry for carrion in nobody's dictionary, I think, had to contain the words "is dead, will be eaten."
Yeah.
Right. And neither of these semantic features was in anybody's dictionary.
And he wanted to know why.
Yeah. And I mean, you could say, well, if you publish that sort of information about everything, you won't bind it all in one cover, So anyway, so he then asked about a few other things, and since I was still had an alive memory of Miss Isle of Dogs 1972, and I had by that time formulated stronger opinions about corpus use and examples and so on. We had quite a long talk about it, and it became clear to me that this was the source of all wisdom for lexicographers, because he explained a little bit about frame semantics, how carrion lies with meat, and it also lies with body, and it also lies with different frames. And so I thought, well, so I read, before that, Chuck had published a very seminal paper called Case for Case.
Oh, yeah.
And Wendy Morris and Wendy also a great friend and lexicographer, had attempted to use Case for Case in the grammar markings for Cobuild. And we kept finding that we had to invent new cases in order to account for phenomena. And I said this to Chuck, and he said, he took me to his office and he opened a drawer, he said, and there was nothing but paper in that drawer. He said, "These are all the corrections that people have sent me," right? So
wow.
However, we then met, that was 1987, I think, and then Antonio Zampoli's set up a summer school for 2 or 3 weeks in Pisa.
Yeah.
Which is where I met Krista Valentola for the first time. And I was there talking about lexicography, and Chuck was there talking about lexical semantics. And I persuaded him to come to a talk I was giving on the use of corpus, on the word risk. And at the beginning I introduced him because he was too distinguished for me to have him in the audience without mentioning him. And he stood up and said, well, look, I'm here. I'm afraid I have to admit that you're not going to persuade me that I need a corpus, because I know that in my head is what I know about language, and that's what I use when I write. So I didn't say anything because he was so distinguished. So I then gave him a little talk about risk, showed corpus data, and at the end he had to go early because he was meeting his wife Lily off the train or something. So he stood up and he said, I'm really terribly sorry, I must now withdraw my comments.
This was about the difference between take a risk and run a risk, wasn't it?
That was the end, was that. But
and what the corpus data showed, which
the question that got him was, what's the difference between there are too many risks there and there's too much risk involved?
Right.
And he couldn't tell me.
Yeah.
And what's more, frame semantics couldn't really tell you either until you really thought about it.
Probably not, no.
And so we then thought we would write about the verb risk. And since he lived in one continent and I lived in another, and we only met at conferences, we had to keep tagging on days here and there to write a bit more about risk. And eventually we wrote Semantics of Risk, which was a long paper. And that by that time I'd got really interested in taking frame semantics and giving a sort of version of frame semantics light, which could be used by lexicographers. And if you remember, I had to give a talk on frame semantics with Chuck Fillmore in the audience in Barcelona, wincing.
And had he set up the FrameNet
No,
project
he and I
by
did
that
frame.
time? Yeah. Well,
No,
why don't you say a bit about that too? The
FrameNet.
FrameNet project in Berkeley.
Well, FrameNet was calqued. The name was calqued on WordNet because there was WordNet at
Princeton. Yeah.
Princeton. So George Miller had set up his WordNet project, and it occurred to me that we could do a lexicography database based on FrameNet, based on frames. So
based on the frame semantics.
the idea was that you would link every word to a frame, and it, by linking it to this frame, it would be linked to all the other words with which it was semantically connected in one of its senses. That's basically the same thing. So I did the lexicography planning for FrameNet, and Chuck did the linguistic theory, which of course was the difficult bit. And FrameNet is still going strong.
It is, yeah.
Colin Baker is still running it. I think he's working with Lakoff at the moment on
Is
Metaphor.
So old Lakoff's still going
Lakoff's
strong?
Still going strong, yes.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, well, no, one of the most interesting experience I had was going with you to Chuck's office. What was the name of that? The research? ICSI.
International Computer Science Institute in Berkeley.
In Berkeley, and having Chuck talk me through how FrameNet worked and show me the software and so on. It was just fascinating.
The software got much better in the second version of it, because of course we used Adam Kilgariff's sketch engine. We'll come on to Adam in a minute.
Indeed.
And you and I actually gave a workshop in Berkeley, which kicked off the American National Corpus.
Wasn't it? It was a DSNA meeting was in Berkeley that
and it was a workshop to kick off the American National Corpus.
Yeah. Well, our goal was to try and convince, one of our goals was to convince American dictionary publishers to use corpus data.
I don't think we ever managed that, but we did manage to get the corpus started.
Failure from that point of view, but
but they did start it.
American, that's right. Yeah. It'd be good to hear a bit more about some of the consultancies you did on academic projects. I'm thinking of people like Ken Church that you worked with.
I didn't work very much with Ken Church. I did a couple of weeks at Bell Labs with Ken Church. But I did work along my main consultancy. I went as a senior visiting scientist, of all things, to IBM in Yorktown Heights, because Roy Bird was a member of the Pisa group. And Roy Bird was the head of the lexical systems unit. And Roy Bird had bought from Longman. He was the one who paid $500,000 for a copy of the tape, the publishing tape of Longman's, and the right to use it for analysis.
And was that because it had all these semantic codes built into
yes,
it?
mainly, and the grammar codes.
And of course the grammar codes, yeah.
But he also saw Collins sold him the Collins Robert as well. And he wanted somebody to unpick the Collins Robert for him.
I see.
So I went there for about 6 or 7 weeks and worked with Roy and his team, and it was really extremely interesting to allow them to unpick the codes, the typeface codes in the Collins Robert, and to define what these various...
The different elements of...
This is the first time I looked at the various elements in the dictionary entry, and after that I wrote quite a lot about it, but...
Yeah, And in fact you also did some other work in the States with Patrick Hanks at the Hector project.
Yeah, with Patrick was at that time a manager at Oxford by that time.
I suppose, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she would have been.
And he set up with Digital Equipment Limited in Palo Alto a project whereby they gave us for a whole year really brilliant computer scientists. One of them had been the person who helped to build the program which transferred money at the end of the day from one major bank to another. So it was he'd worked at Yale on that project, and they were brilliant. And we were to write dictionary entries. We were to tell them everything we wanted the computer to do, and they would somehow get it. See what. And
what were you using for a corpus?
We used the British National Corpus.
So that already existed. We're going to need to come back to that.
So. And several people like Rosamund Moon, who became a distinguished academic and lexicographer in Birmingham, stayed for a long period in Palo Alto and worked for a very long period with the Palo Alto team. But Patrick and I went out and in and out and in. And
what was the outcome of the Hector project?
Well, we couldn't understand, because every time the system crashed, they were all delighted. We would walk around and look at the air and go for meals in nice restaurants. And they would be, and it turned out they had picked lexicography. They obviously, after the first 3 or 4 weeks, it was clear they had no interest in language. They weren't building a language tool. They wouldn't tell us what they were building. It turned out they were building something called Alta
Vista.
And it was supposed to be a
very early search engine.
It was supposed to take out Google or whatever the Google.
Well, I don't think Google existed then.
No, but it was a corpus. It was a database search engine from the World Wide Web. And so every time it crashed, it was wonderful for them, because they knew what query had crashed it.
Yeah.
And we were sitting there, crashing there.
So you were unwitting sort of collaborators.
I only learned that after the Hector project finished. Yes.
Anyway, of course, you mentioned the British National Corpus there that you were using on the Hector project, and I'd be interested to hear. I mean, how that. I mean, I was involved in it too at a later stage, but the genesis of it. I mean, how did
I should say about the Hector project. It was the first place where lexicographers had a bank of six screens. Yeah. And anyone who was pregnant or thought they might be pregnant was told never to walk behind the 6 screens, right? And so if ever you saw anyone behind the screens, you were pretty sure it was a man, because nobody was going to take that sort of risk even at people's advanced age. So
you're like sort of city traders or something.
British National Corpus. Well, it was the first time they moved a cursor from one screen to the other and kept the data intact. Yeah. It was brilliant to work with.
Yeah, that would have been very cutting edge. But anyway, let's go back to the BNC.
Well, after the Grosseto conference and Zampoli's interest in corpora, Jeremy Clear and Nick Osler and I wrote a paper about structuring a corpus and defining a corpus and building a corpus. And
Jeremy Clear, of course, was the computer whiz at Cobuild, and Nick Osler.
Nick Osler was a linguist. He studied at MIT, and he's now particularly interested. He is also an extraordinary linguist. He's a classicist and writes books about ancient languages. And he also runs the Society or something for Endangered Languages.
That's right,
So he and Jeremy and I had written about what you need to think about when you're building a corpus. And Collins I wanted Collins to have a corpus. Collins refused to take any interest in building a corpus because, of course, they had already got the Cobuild corpus,
yeah.
but Collins would not share the Cobuild corpus with anyone,
Right.
so that nobody else had a corpus but Collins.
Mm.
So I thought when I went, I was then asked to join OUP in order to bail out their moribund attempts at a French dictionary, which eventually became a really good French dictionary, the Oxford Hachette. And I wanted OUP to build a corpus,
yeah.
which could be a national corpus for everyone to use, computer scientists.
Oh, so how did they respond to that?
Well, they said to me, look, we don't need a corpus. We have got, they took me along to their archive room, and there was 6x6 index cards written starting in mid 1800s or something.
Yeah, they would have been
The
from about
OED
the
cards,
1860s.
yes,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And there were thousands and thousands of them, and said, this is our corpus. So I said, well, I think we need a corpus that you can read with a computer. So after a lot, so I also was interviewed before I went by somebody extremely high up in OUP, and they said, what would you like us to do? And I said, I'd like to build a corpus. And they said, oh, forget it. So they did, in fact, set up a system. Tim Benbow, who was an excellent manager there. In fact, in my whole career, I've had two managers. One was Richard Thomas in Collins, and one was Tim Benbow in Oxford, and they were both brilliant. They never put anything in writing. They never went back on their word. They supported you through thick and thin, and they got dictionaries out. And,
2 out of 2.
2 out of 2. Pretty good.
That's pretty good going, I don't think.
Anyway, they didn't want to fund it themselves, obviously. Who would? So they got together with...
yeah, I mean, it's worth saying that at that time, building a corpus was not
really
a trivial proposition.
Nobody wanted to give you their text because they thought you were going to go and publish a
Never
pilot
understood
edition
really,
of
did
it,
they?
yes.
Yeah.
So eventually we got Della Summers at Longman to agree with us that a corpus could be what they called pre-commercial.
Yeah, it was called a pre-competitive resource, I think, wasn't it?
Pre-competitive resource, something like that. It was
the
before...
natural competitors could still use it.
We could all use the same corpus and produce completely different dictionaries.
Yeah, which is
So
a good
Longman came in, Oxford,
Chambers,
University
I
of
think,
Lancaster.
Yeah. British Library.
British Library was one.
Oxford University.
Computing Science.
It wasn't Chambers, the other
No,
publisher
Chambers
involved.
didn't come
They
in,
went
no.
back
It
then,
was
yeah.
British Library, and
Lancaster, of course, did
Lancaster
the tagging.
did the semantic tagging,
yeah,
which
yeah.
didn't get very far, that one. But eventually we did build a corpus, and it was extremely difficult to persuade publishers that we would like to use their electronic versions of their books without going and publishing them in the Philippines and things like this. But
No,
but
I remember.
BNC
all
worked,
those,
and they're still in use, in fact. The BNC.
And how was it that the BNC, I don't remember the overall cost of it, I know it was in the millions,
Yes.
but you managed to get funding from the British government.
We got some funding from the government.
Yeah.
Because of the involvement of the universities and the library.
Yeah.
And as I recollect, at the end and the launch of the BNC, you were chosen to be the acceptable face of lexicography.
Was it just me? I do remember having to
It was
give a talk.
just you. I was told to stand at the back and not interrupt.
I feel really bad about this now. So.
No, but you didn't know I was standing at the back and not interrupting.
No, all I remember was being intensely nervous because I was using a kind of very early version of a projector, a data projector.
Yes, I remember.
You remember those things?
I remember
you
that,
had to put a sort of tablet on top of an overhead projector, and you were just constantly terrified that it would break down, because they nearly always did. Somehow it kind of worked out.
And you were faced with 250 people who had been completely selected for an inability to understand what corpus data was.
That as well. Yeah. Oh well. You should have done it instead of me.
No fears and no good.
How it was that I
Nothing
was picked to do that, but anyway, there we are. So,
and it was the BNC, in fact, which was used at FrameNet. That's what started FrameNet.
Yeah, of course,
They
that's
used
right.
FrameNet for their
And
corpus analysis.
I do remember you were involved in a lot of European projects as well, like the Delis and so on, and worked with.
That was again the Zampoli connection.
Yeah.
And with Delis was the first international research project which was really rooted in frame semantics, because we worked with a lot of really, really good people. Uli Haidt Ulrich Heit from
The
Stuttgart,
great Uli, yes.
who was brilliant organiser, and a
Yeah.
brilliant linguist, but particularly good organiser. And
also
Nick
a
Osler was
very nice person to work
and
with.
very nice, very pleasant. Yes.
Tremendously dry sense of humour.
Yes,
really.
absolutely. Yeah, he was brilliant, Uli. And also Uli Norling Christensen, who had been eminent in Euralex. And there was Dutch, French, English, Danish, Italian, of course, Italian.
Mm-hmm.
And we all decided that we would write entries for the sensation frame,
Right.
and we would write the entries for touch, see, hear, and so on.
Vision and things like that. Yeah.
And we would then code them from the frame point of view, you know, which frame elements were realised and how they were realised in different languages, which essentially gave us a mini corpus where you could use the frame semantic coding as an interlingua between the two languages. You know, if you want to express A plus B plus C in English, you go to A plus B plus C. And that was very interesting. And Chuck Fillmore was an advisor. He was American, so he couldn't be a real member. But of course, he was the foundation of it all and came to all the meetings. And as a result of the Delos project, of course, we took it on to FrameNet when we saw it, how interesting it was. There was also a project called Decide which always worried me because you don't want verbs as project names. It's really difficult to refer to them. But anyway, Decide was Thierry Fontenelle's baby.
Yes. So
And
what was the goal of
Well, it was to
Decide
carry on the extraction of automatic information extraction.
Yeah.
And Uli Heit was in that one as well, and it was interesting. They matched dictionaries together, and they went on, I think Stuttgart and the University of Liège went on working together on that area for quite a long.
And
then there were
getting back to FrameNet, I mean, and your work with Chuck Fillmore, I mean, how would you say that affected or influenced your work as a hands-on lexicographer?
Well, working with Chuck, apart from being a complete delight because of the way his mind worked, and because he was such a terribly nice person, he was such you know him well, and he was absolute honey. But it actually taught me a huge amount about grammar and a huge amount about lexical semantics, and that's what I've always been interested in, so that it was the most interesting part of work that I've ever done. But it also made it impossible for me to write dictionary entries anymore. After that, I never managed to write a single print dictionary entry.
Yeah. Oh well, by that time you'd sort of moved on and other people were taking up the mantle. And I mean, really going from being, as it were, a student of somebody like Chuck Fillmore, I mean, you then moved very much into teaching and training lexicographers, training linguists, and so on. I was, yes.
Yes, when I went to OUP, I started by we corralled all the lexicographers into the cricket pavilion in Oxford, and for 3 weeks we taught them.
Yeah.
We taught them, and I think in fact the Palo Alto people came at the same time, so we taught them lexicography as well. So by the time that finished, I'd got some idea of a lexicography course.
Yeah, like
and
a
then
sort
I
of
had,
syllabus. Yeah,
I gave quite a lot of workshops for various publishers, like there was Gummerus in Finland, and there was the Danish Woodbook in Denmark, and so on.
Yeah.
And then Penny Silva, who was the editor of the Oxford Dictionary of South African English. Remember Penny? Penny, absolutely organised, wonderful woman, and a good lexicographer, excellent lexicographer. She wanted to set up a lexicography workshop in South Africa because what had happened there, very simplistically, was that Nelson Mandela had become the president, and he had set up a dictionary bill, which meant he felt particularly strongly that if you didn't have a dictionary for your native language, you perpetually felt at a loss.
And your identity was.
You were identified as a second-class citizen. And of course, the few dictionaries that there were for Zulu or any of the other major South African languages, apart from Afrikaans, which had a big dictionary project going, and of course the Oxford Dictionary of South African English, these dictionaries were missionary dictionaries, and they tended to be things like a word in a South African language and then a translation like the bush in which the mother-in-law sits while the second child is born, and ridiculous dictionaries.
Yeah.
So
yeah, as I recall, I mean, South Africa went from having 2 national languages, English and Afrikaans, to 11, I think.
11, I
So
think,
there were
yes.
9 African languages were
and
made.
these languages were being taught in universities by linguists, good linguists, but they had never done any lexicography. So Penny set up a 2-week workshop, and since she was over in Oxford and I was employed by Oxford, and she asked me if I would go out and start this workshop. And I thought, well, yes, I would do it because I was interested. But I was damn well not going to do it myself. I never did anything by myself, and I wasn't going to start then. So I thought, who is the most nice person I could live with for 2 weeks, and yet is competent and would do things really well and turn up on time and know what he was doing? And that's how you and I got together. So we went off.
In training mode, yes.
We went off to set up a workshop.
In Grahamstown. We were with Edmund Viner.
With Edmund Viner,
from
that's right.
OUP, from the OED.
Yes. Yes. And there were about 75, I think, linguists at that.
They were big classes, I remember that.
Yes, they were huge classes. Yeah. And we did practical lexicography, and I did all the wrong things. I mean, one of the things I said was, well, I'm only going to give you half an hour on headwords, because of course headwords are so easy. And it turned out that the most difficult thing of all in many of the African languages
in those Bantu
was a
languages,
headword.
What do you identify as
which of the many millions sometimes of forms of the word could you consider as a headword? And then I also had the one entry that I had plotted out in great detail in order for people to have an English framework to work on in the bilingual thing. I think this was the following year when we did the bilingual one, was the word green. And it turned out that many of the languages in the room had no word for green. They'd stopped at blue and they'd moved on to, I don't know, red or something. And so all in all, it was...
Yeah, I mean, it was very impressive learning. I mean, obviously we learned it probably more than we taught, amazing, because learning about the immense complexity of the morphology of those Bantu languages.
But I remember we were sitting at a lunch in Pretoria University, and I felt so... You talk about imposter syndrome. The woman I was sitting beside talked one language to her child, one language to her husband and her mother-in-law, a completely different language from the language she'd learned at school, a language she'd learned at home. And she also spoke a completely different African language, the woman serving us.
Yeah.
And I was sitting beside this multi-talented person who was a junior lecturer in one of the universities. And I really felt that it was difficult to stand up that afternoon and carry on.
I know you mean. Yeah, I mean, well, multilingualism is the norm in Africa, and in South Africa everyone would know English, Afrikaans, and their first language.
Well, and many other languages too. Yes, depending on who they married and who they were living with and working with.
Yeah. Yes. So in fact, you and I did that course. We called it SALEX, South African Lexicography, in '97, I think, with the one that Penny Silver organised,
and then you and I organised jointly the next one. The next one, yes.
But with our great friend Danny Prinsloo, who was really the host of that.
He was Professor of African Languages at Pretoria, and also Danny Prinsloo was wonderful. It was like living with a charged dynamo.
Yep.
But then when we thought that we couldn't get anyone more energetic than Danny, he produced his sidekick, who turned out to be Gilles Maurice Schrijver, who, as everyone knows, he's now president of Euralex, is undoubtedly even more dynamically charged than Danny.
But at that time, Gilles Maurice was this sort of scruffy research assistant who actually slept in Dan's office.
He slept in Dan's office.
But he stayed up so late trying to compile a corpora of...
and print things.
And then you would go in the morning and Gilles Maurice would be there sort of looking...
Absolutely. I used to swear he slept on top of people's homework. By the time he got the homework back, it was as if Gilles Maurice had slept on it. But he was brilliant. Between them, they carried it off beautifully, and it was wonderful.
And in fact, shortly after that, I mean, you and I, we pondered the idea of running courses in practical lexicography where you would have a theoretical element and a lot of hands-on.
And for lexicographers and computer scientists.
Yeah, exactly. And of course that was when we decided that although, you were the sort of doyen of bilingual lexicography, I knew quite a bit about monolingual.
You were the doyen of monolingual.
What we lacked, what our little partnership lacked, was somebody really good on the computer, on the computer side, on the computational linguist, really, and who of course was our dear friend Adam Kilgareth, who joined our
Adam then,
group.
You knew Adam before then, because he
I'd
had
known
worked
Adam
in Longman
for quite a while, and he had worked at Longman for a bit.
Yes.
I knew him when he was doing his PhD because he'd sent questions round to various lexicographers saying, what do you do about this and what do you do about that, and so we sort of got to know one another that way.
He had turned up at a Prague summer school that Chuck and I had taught at, because I knew I'd seen him before. And Patrick Hanks sent me a note once saying, look out for Adam Kilgareth, very bright lad.
Well,
that was before I met him, yes.
Yeah, so we then set up what we called Lexicography Masterclass, rather bombastically.
You and I were already we had formed a partnership, don't you remember?
We did actually.
We had already run several training things.
Must have done. That's right.
Because I remember sitting in a cafe in South Africa every evening, planning what we were going to do when we were millionaires. Didn't work
that worked out well.
No.
But then, and then we started. We did our first Lexicom workshop in the University of Brighton, where Adam at that point was a research fellow at.
Yes.
ITRI.
Yes.
Information
Adam was brilliant.
Research Institute.
There's no question about it. Adam was a lateral thinker and completely brilliant.
Yeah, and he was lateral thinker, thinking out of the box, being able to just look at things in a very different way.
He was very interesting, very, very good, Adam. It's sad that we lost Adam because he was so wonderfully good.
Sad for the whole community.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Adam's great thing was that he straddled the world between computational linguistics, corpus linguistics, and lexicography.
And he knew what he was talking about.
And kind of understood lexicography quite well, I think.
You can tell that from the software. I mean, from the sketch engine, there's no doubt about it. It was the best corpus querying software.
Yeah, still is.
Still is, yes.
Yeah.
But you had a lot to do with that because you and Adam wrote algorithms, didn't you, for good examples?
I didn't write the algorithms. What would tend to happen was that I would go to Adam with a problem and say, well, in fact, that was
spit out the good example from these.
Yes, how do you highlight the good examples? But even more interestingly, when we were developing the Macmillan dictionary, which was a sort of from scratch new pedagogical dictionary in the late 90s. I remember
you won an award.
But those are.
I remember you receiving an award from the royal family. I don't know which one.
Duke of Edinburgh.
One of them. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah, thankfully not from Prince Andrew. And but I remember going to Adam and saying, well, one of the things I would like to do in this new dictionary is give a really systematic account of collocation in English. And how can we do that? We can read concordance lines and say, well, that's an interesting that looks like a good one, but that's very laborious and really not very systematic. Very error prone way of doing things, and that was where Adam was at the time working in ITRI on a project called WASPs.
Yes,
with
that was the initial
very nice
sketch
chap
engine.
who also died sadly, David Tugwell.
Yes.
And the WASP project was kind of exactly matched what I was looking for, because it looked at it took the corpus data for a given word, like a word advice or something, and it would look at the frequent collocates
grammatical roles
and the various
and
grammatical
the
relations, whether it's verb
roles,
governing a noun or adjective modifying a
that was
noun and so forth. And so that worked out, and that eventually turned into the word sketches.
And that in fact happened because of the first Lexicom in Brighton, because Pavel,
the great Pavel Richley.
Pavel Richley, and he had a good fast program, and he united Pavel's programming and Adam's linguistic knowledge.
Pavel had a brilliant concordancer, and it's hard to remember now that in those days it kind of was quite laborious sometimes. You would call up a concordance and the damn thing would take forever to come. And Pavel had somehow, through wizardry, had got this concordancing machine that was very, very fast, and Adam
was very good at that, spotting talent that he could use.
So they worked together. So the sketch engine was effectively Pavel's concordancer, Adam's research project, and Pavel's genius.
And
of
you are
a
still
programmer.
working now. I've retired. I mean, I'm now, set on the
I've kind of
shores.
retired. I'm still doing Lexicom.
You're still doing Lexicom.
Without you, Sue. But
Lexicom was
the same.
good because Lexicom, we brought together computer scientists that had no idea about lexicography and lexicographers that had no idea about computer science.
And translators who,
and let them
who were heavy
understand what
dictionary
the other
users
half
and
were
so
doing,
forth, yeah.
so when they had to
Yeah,
work with each
yeah,
other, it
yeah.
was easier.
Well, it's still going strong,
So-
and we're always amazed every year that people still turn
This
up.
must be about the 20th Lexicom, is it?
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
started
we've got
about
one
2000,
coming up in
yes.
Cambridge
Yes.
in the autumn. So
Mhm.
yes, we started. Was it 2001 or maybe 2000?
Yeah, 2001, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
And you and I taught an MA, half an MA in
Indeed,
Brighton.
and Adam
yes.
too. Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you Sue, also about, or talk about the other things that we did in Lexicography Masterclass. I mean, running
Oh, yes.
the Lexicom courses is the part of that that's actually still going. But in fact, we were also involved in project management for
Absolutely.
other people. We were sort of selling our services, and tell us a bit about
Well, I think we were approached
these projects.
because of our website by Michal
O'Grugan
Grugan, and he said, I represent
and
Forest
Joseph
Nagel.
O'Murku was in fact
Yes.
the first person.
Was he there at the same time?
Yes.
And we met in Gatwick
Gatwick
Airport.
Airport. Yeah.
And they said, we have got a grant from the joint United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland to further cultural activities, and we want to write.
And this was in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes,
I
it
think,
was.
wasn't
It was in
that
fact
brought
for a long
peace
time
to
the
Northern
only
Ireland,
thing
yeah.
that
Yeah,
lasted from the
yeah.
Good Friday Agreement, and we'd like to do an English-Irish dictionary.
Yeah.
And so we wonder if you could tell us, just put it down the back of an envelope, how much it would cost and how
Of
many
course.
people we need. So we then did for them a whole year's pilot study, which included costing, budgeting,
Sample entries,
sample entries,
style
compiler
guides,
instruction,
yeah,
building a
all of that.
corpus.
Yes,
the
building
lot,
an Irish
the lot.
corpus, a corpus of Irish and a corpus of Hibernian English. I think,
That's
wasn't
right.
it? Yeah.
Yes. And we put together a little team of one Irish lexicographer and one English lexicographer to write the entries, and as a result of that, they then got funding for the dictionary, and but they then had to put it out to tender again for managing the dictionary.
Yeah.
But by a blessed miracle, we were offered the contract, and we then ran the
I don't
Forest
think there's anything
Nagel.
miraculous about it. I don't think anyone else wanted to take it on. But,
No one else in their right mind would have done it.
Yeah.
And we then built a database, which is called Dante, the database of annotated,
Analysed text.
Analysed
of
text,
English,
that's it.
Yeah.
and that database is still available on the web, and it is readable both by machines and by human beings.
Yeah.
And it was simply an analysis of the English to form a basis for an English-Irish dictionary.
And the most
And you could
detailed
tell us-
analysis of English.
And
in
it was
existence
coded, it
still.
was tagged
Yeah.
and coded
Yeah.
for dictionary, for computer use. That was the last thing I did. I then retired.
Well, you went
Not
out.
exactly in a blaze of
You
glory,
went,
but I
so
retired.
you went out on a high. I mean,
Yes.
I remember.
That was a
us-
brilliant database.
It was, and it was a great project, and I think we were quite lucky in that the first person we'd met, Michal O'Grugan, kind of bowed out, and,
Yes,
and
Joseph.
we didn't always have the best relations with him, but they brought in a really excellent
Cahill.
project manager, Carl Convery.
Cahill?
Yes,
What's his
Convery,
last name?
his second name.
Okay. Cahill Convery, that's
yes.
right. And he was very good.
Who
yes.
we loved, and
We loved him.
we worked with. Very
And between
happily.
us, we actually did, and Philippe's software.
Of course, yes. Around the same time,
Yes.
the DPS, which is effectively a dictionary writing software launched by IBM, IDM, I should say, a
IDM,
French
yes,
company,
yes.
run by Philippe Clément, which
Yes.
is the same software, or a version of it is still being used.
Yes, it was used at Longman, I think,
Well,
and in Oxford and everywhere else now.
Macmillan,
Yes.
Longman,
It's
Cambridge,
very good.
yeah.
It's very
yeah,
good.
yeah.
So we finished in the Dante dictionary. That's it.
Yeah.
That's.
Yeah.
Then I retired.
So, I don't know if you want to
2010.
sort of wrap this up by. I mean, what do you find the hardest and most challenging, or what did you find when you were?
But the
Using-
hardest thing about being a lexicographer is knowing too much. If you do your research right, you know far too much. And if you write your dictionary entry on the same day as you do you end the research, you just simply know too much to be able to filter it for a user that knows nothing.
Yeah,
so
you become the world expert
yes,
on that
absolutely,
particular word.
You're the world expert on that word.
For
so
24 hours.
The hardest thing is actually getting rid of facts which you know to be facts, but which you cannot find room to put in the dictionary.
But that's what editing is, isn't it?
Yes. I think Collins really paid me simply to strike out other people's work. I was the one that was boldest with the black pen and kept it down to the right size.
Yeah, so and it's very true what you say about knowing too much, because I remember again going back to the morning that I spent with you and Chuck in Berkeley,
yes,
and I had a go at his system, and you and I kind of knocked out about 10 entries,
right,
and
yes.
Chuck said, "Oh, you know, my research students, it would have taken them 2 weeks to do that." And I said, "Yeah, that's because we're lexicographers, and you can't hang around, you know." And they all knew too much. They would sort of get fascinated by the smallest detail.
But they also didn't need to be paid at the end of the week.
Yeah,
you know, if you get paid piecework, it's a marvellous thing for getting.
It's a great.
That was the most difficult thing. I think the most difficult thing for an editor is actually to edit down somebody's work without offending them.
Yeah.
That's, yes. I think the most useful thing I did perhaps was to take lexicography to a point where you trained people to do things, because the way I learned, I never learned, but the way I saw other people learning lexicography was they wrote an entry and someone came along and said, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong, take it back and do it better. And it was really that sort of ridiculous thing of just telling people what was wrong with the entry that made you think about what was right with the entry.
Yeah, it's a very hard skill, that. Well, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground.
I've retired now, so I can stop.
Yeah, and so thank
you, Michael. I've enjoyed the last 35 years. It's been wonderful. Thank you.